Okay, so welcome to this first session on the Heart Sutra. And what we're going to do to begin today is recite the sutra together. So again, if you have your copy handy, that would be useful. And sometimes this is chanted, and Lama Zopa really likes people to chant it, but my chanting voice is not so good. So I think we'll just do a recitation of it. All right. So thus did I hear at one time. The Bhagawan was dwelling on massive Vulture's mountain in Rajagriha, together with a great community of monks and a great community of bodhisattvas. At that time, the Bhagawan was absorbed in the concentration on the categories of phenomena called profound perception. Also at that time, the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya Avalokiteshvara, looked upon the very practice of the profound perfection of wisdom and beheld those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Then, through the power of Buddha, the Venerable Shariputra said this to the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya Avalokiteshvara: how should any son of the lineage train who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom? He said that, and the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya Avalokiteshvara said this to the Venerable Sharadvatiputra: Shariputra, any son of the lineage or daughter of the lineage who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom should look upon it like this, correctly and repeatedly beholding those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Form is empty, emptiness is form. Emptiness is not other than form. Form is also not other than emptiness. In the same way, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and consciousness are empty. Shariputra, likewise, all phenomena are emptiness, without characteristic, unproduced, unceased, stainless, not without stain, not deficient, not fulfilled. Shariputra, therefore in emptiness there is no form, no feeling, no discrimination, no compositional factors, no consciousness, no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no visual form, no sound, no odor, no taste, no object of touch, and no phenomenon. There is no I element, and so on up to and including no mind element, and no mental consciousness element. There is no ignorance, no extinction of ignorance, and so on up to and including no aging and death, and no extinction of aging and death. Similarly, there is no suffering, origination, cessation, and path. There is no exalted wisdom, no attainment, and also no non-attainment. Shariputra, therefore, because there is no attainment, bodhisattvas rely on and dwell in the perfection of wisdom, the mind without obscuration and without fear. Having completely passed beyond error, they reach the endpoint of nirvana. All the Buddhas who dwell in the three times also manifestly, completely awaken to unsurpassable, perfect, complete enlightenment in reliance on the perfection of wisdom. Therefore, the mantra of the perfection of wisdom, the mantra of great knowledge, the unsurpassed mantra, the mantra equal to the unequaled, the mantra that thoroughly pacifies all suffering, should be known as truth, since it is not false. The mantra of the perfection of wisdom is declared: Tayata, Om Gate, Gate, Paragate, Parasamgate, Bodhi Soha. Shariputra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, should train in the profound perfection of wisdom like that. Then the Bhagawan arose from that concentration and commended the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara, saying, well, said, son of the lineage. It is like that. It is like that. One should practice the profound perfection of wisdom, just as you have indicated. Even the Tathagatas rejoice. The Bhagawan having thus spoken, the Venerable Sharadvatiputra, the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya Avalokiteshvara, those surrounding in their entirety, along with the world of gods, humans, asuras, and Gandharvas, were overjoyed and highly praised that spoken by the Bhagawan. So then let's do the refuge verse 3 times. We'll do the first time in English, and then the second and third time in the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyen gipe sonam gi drola penchir sangye drupar shog. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chanyan gipe sonam gi drola penchir sangye drupar sho. So then before we begin, let's just do a short reflection in order to focus our minds a little bit, and then also to set our motivation for being here, for participating in this class today. So just find a comfortable posture, and then spend a few minutes focusing on the breath in order to calm the mind. And then after this, I'll lead you in a short reflection to set motivation. So just spend a few minutes in silence, meditating on the breath. So the Heart Sutra that we're going to be studying is a Mahayana Sutra. And as such, it is designed and created for the purpose of helping us and all beings to attain our greatest potential, to attain the state of enlightenment. So it's very important that we adjust our motivation to that degree to make sure that we make the best use of this time together in studying this very powerful and profound sutra. So just take a moment to reflect on the suffering nature of samsara, the ways in which ourselves and all sentient beings are trapped in this cycle of existence, going from life to life under the control of our karma and our delusions. And the root delusion of ignorance, our not knowing the nature of reality, that is driving everything. In this sutra, we're going to learn much more about the wisdom of emptiness that is the antidote to that ignorance, that is the key to help us to not only be free from our own suffering, but to attain the state of Buddhahood where we can help others to do the same. So with a strong compassion and a love for all sentient beings, a recognition that all of these beings have been incredibly kind to us and have helped us in numerous ways, and not just this life, but countless lifetimes, we set that intention of benefiting all sentient beings. As Lama Zopa Rinpoche says, this is the heart of bodhicitta, is the wish to benefit all, the wish to be of the greatest possible benefit to each and every sentient being without exception. And then the secondary motivation, that is the acknowledgement that we're incapable of doing this in our current state. We need to become enlightened in order to accomplish this. Therefore, we set those two aims of bodhicitta, the wish to benefit all sentient beings and the wish to become enlightened ourselves so we can accomplish that. And hold that very deeply in your heart for this teaching as well as throughout this life so it can become the cause for you to attain that state and to lead others to attaining it as well. And then you can open your eyes fully and we'll begin. So again, in this initial session, I don't know that we're going to get into the sutra quite as much or the commentary, but I thought it was really important to spend some time going over some of the details that are the background for the Heart Sutra, and that also inform, since I don't know everyone who's here, whether you've studied some of these other topics, to give you a little bit more background so that when we get into the Heart Sutra, it will make a little bit more sense. So I just want to speak a little bit about the basic program before we get started, which is it's certainly possible for you to do this course as part of the basic program of the FPMT, and I'll give more instruction as it goes on, but I've got a few slides that I put together for that. So let me get this up. I have to do the slideshow from here, I think. Let's see. All right. So you should be seeing the Heart Sutra Class 1 in front of you now. So I don't know if you can see all of this because the way I've got this slide, and on my screen at least, there's a little bit that's blocked by the, the screens on the side. But the FPMT basic program was devised by Lama Zopa Rinpoche for Dharma students who wish to progress beyond introductory courses and are ready to commit to more in-depth study and practice. It offers a text-based introduction to the philosophical as well as the other aspects of the Tibetan Buddhist Gelugpa tradition. So a lot of it is philosophy, but there's also a lot of practice orientation in the basic program. So the basic program itself, the study component to it, there are various components to the basic program, consists of 9 core curriculum subjects. And you can look these up online at the FPMT's website. I'm not going to go into all of them today. In addition, there are 3 supplementary subjects. The Heart Sutra is one of these 9 core curriculum subjects. Lama Zopa in particular felt that this was an important subject to study as part of the view of emptiness. Just so you know, a few of the other ones that are included in the 9, it includes Master Shantideva's Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. It includes Lama Tsongkhapa's Middle Length Lam Rim, The Wheel of Sharp Weapons, a number of other texts. And some of them do get much more philosophical. I'm going to touch on a few of the things in the introduction today that do come from the study of tenets, for example, which is another one of the core curriculum subjects. But these were selected by a panel of geshes that were drawn from the FPMT, and along with Rinpoche's approval, they were designed to provide that more in-depth philosophical and practical study of the subjects in the Gelugpa tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. Each one of these has a completion test. So if you were to do this course on the Heart Sutra for the basic program completion, then you would need to take a test. There is discussion, homework, and reading assignments. As we go through this, I'll try to supply some form of homework and reading assignments. For this one, not so much reading. There's a few texts out there certainly, and I'll be happy to supply you with a reading list of various texts that can be used to supplement your study. But in terms of this one, there's not quite as much. This is a much shorter course. I think it's the shortest course of all of the basic program subjects. The basic program itself, to complete it, does require attending a 3-month final review and then a final exam that covers all 9 subjects. So even if you haven't decided whether you want to take the basic program at this level, it would be fine to take just this subject at that level. Then all you'd have to do is, the first few points, do whatever discussion, homework, reading assignments, and then complete the test for this course in particular. And I'll be the one that you send that test to and be the one grading it and what have you. In addition, there's an ethical behavior component, which essentially involves adhering to the 5 lay precepts that are in our Buddhist tradition. These include not killing, not stealing, not engaging in adultery or any other forms of abusive sexual behavior, not lying, and then not partaking of intoxicants, alcohol, and so on. Now, for this study, it doesn't mean that you have to take those vows. If you've taken those vows, that's great. And even if you haven't taken, all of them, it's perfectly fine. It just means that while in the time while we are together and doing all of this, we want to adhere by those as best as we can, and try to adhere by them in our lives outside of here as well. But it's not necessary for you to take these vows if you haven't taken them. And there are a few other components that Rinpoche spells out. Again, that can be found at the FPMT's website, or I can send that along to you. But again, I'm not sure what degree of interest there is in the basic program, but if you are interested in that, do let Maria know, and I'll make sure to get all the information to you. The third component of our basic program is a practice component. And as much as possible, I'll try to do, some form of meditation assignments. For the Heart Sutra, it's good if you can do a form of retreat on your own. If you do have an ability to do that, I don't know that we're going to be able to organize anything like that, a sort of practice day or short retreat. The FPMT, for the completion of the entire basic program, does require a 3-month Lam Rim retreat. My understanding, though I'd have to clarify this, is that you can do it as 3 individual months. So you could do a month in 1 year, a month in another year, and then the third month in a different year. Or you could do it as an entire sequential 3 months, which is hard for many people to do. But nonetheless, there are different options on fulfilling that requirement. But definitely the purpose of the basic program isn't just so that we have all this information and we can talk about the Heart Sutra to other people. While that's a useful thing to do, that's not the main aim. The main aim is for us to integrate this into our own practice, into our own hearts and minds. So that's why the practice component is a really important part of this. As we go through this course on the Heart Sutra, for example, I'm going to be encouraging you to, whatever portion of the Heart Sutra we've gone through, to spend some time reflecting on it. Or some part of the Heart Sutra that you feel some inclination towards to maybe recite it daily, but in the middle of it, of the recitation, you could spend some time in meditation on that portion of the Heart Sutra. There's also ideally a service and training component, and this will kind of allow people to be more involved in being of service to their communities as well as the FPMT, to train, to be able to lead discussion groups or other activities. So if there are opportunities to do that, I don't know whether they'll arise with this online course, but that's another component that is stressed in regard to completing basic program. The subject completion requirements. So again, for each subject that we're doing, for example, the Heart Sutra that this course is about, there's an attendance and participation requirement. So if by chance, again, you miss one of the sessions, they'll all be recorded and you can find them online and be able to make up those sessions. There'll be a meditation requirement. And again, this is not something that I'm going to be checking. I can't possibly know whether you've done meditations or not. I will give the assignments and hopefully you'll be able to kind of keep track on your own of what you are doing. The behavior requirement is required for each of the individual modules. So again, just stressing that you should try to abide by the 5 lay precepts as much as possible during your study of this. And then the subject completion tests. As I said, I'll have something designed or use one of the tests that has been designed by another basic program teacher that will give you an opportunity to review and give me an assessment of how well you comprehended the material and worked with it. The exams aren't huge. These tests aren't, I mean, the final exam I think is much larger, obviously, but the subject completion tests is something that I'll be happy to provide you with how to study for it so that you can, feel very competent in doing all that study. And then you'll sit down and actually do the test for that, send it off to me in a file, and then again, I'll grade it. But the idea is to do it without making reference to other materials, to do it as a closed book test. For the program completion requirements, again, you do have to complete all 9 of the core curriculum subjects. The 3 that are supplementary are not required. They're good to take, but again, they're not offered quite as frequently, so it might be hard to be able to do all of those. You have to participate in the 3-month final review, as I mentioned earlier. You have to pass the final exam, and then you have to complete the 3-month Lam Rim retreat or 3 one-month Lam Rim retreats. I think that's everything in regard to the basic program. What we can do is maybe stop here and see if there are any questions. And if you do have a question, you could unmute your microphone and then just let me know. As I said, there's a lot more information out at the FPMT's website. And if you have further questions down the road, just direct those to Maria and she will direct them on to me. No questions? Okay. All right, so let's go back then to the screen that I was sharing. Whoops, how did I get to that? Let me start there then. Do slideshow from there. All right, so what I'd like to cover as much as possible today are these 5 subjects that give us a context for our study of the Heart Sutra. And the very first of these is the teachings of the Buddha, kind of where this fits into the teachings of the Buddha in a very general way, because we're going to talk more specifically in the second point, as well as the Lam Rim. I always like to drive everything back to the Lam Rim, even though the basic program covers a lot of subjects that are kind of very peripheral. They do have validity in regard to our study of the Lam Rim, the stages of the path, so I want to get a little grounded in that. The second one is the 3 turnings of the Wheel of Dharma, where the Heart Sutra fits at in regard to that, and give you some context of these 3 turnings. The 4 schools of Buddhist tenets that some of you have studied, but I want to make sure that we have at least some grounding in what those are and kind of their differences to some degree. We won't go into an in-depth study because obviously that's covered in the basic program subject on that, and it would be really outside the scope of what we're studying here. Also, what's called the 4 seals of Buddhism, which are what the Buddhist tenets, regardless of what tenet system or philosophical system we're talking about, what they have in common. What are the 4 things that indicate that it's a Buddhist philosophical system? And these are really useful to study because they kind of indicate what it does it mean to really be Buddhist. And then finally, the types of selflessness that are part of exploring one of those 4 seals. So in terms of the teachings of the Buddha, let's go ahead and take it off screen for now. The teachings of the Buddha, obviously, the Buddha taught for some 45 years. He was able to expound greatly on a variety of teachings. And of course, in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, we do have these teachings that have been put together into what's called the Lam Rim. The Buddhist teachings, in terms of historically, the very first that came were what are known as the Pali Canon. The Pali Canon, the Pali language, these teachings were disseminated after the time of the Buddha, probably within the first 100 to 200 years of the Buddha, after the Buddha's passing, when they were holding these councils and they decided that they needed to put down in writing what the Buddha had taught. And the Pali Canon made its way into sort of Southeast Asia. It's what's still relied upon in the Theravadan tradition, the traditions that are studied in Thailand and Burma, what's Myanmar now, all these countries, again, and mostly the southeastern part of Asia, down into Indonesia and what have you. The Sanskrit teachings of the Buddha, which were disseminated much later, written in that language, there's a lot of kind of mythology around them. And the Heart Sutra itself is one of these in the Mahayana Sanskrit tradition. So what came to be known as the Hinayana tradition, and I'll go into this a little bit later when we get into the tenet systems, was based primarily on the Pali Canon. What has come to be known as the Mahayana tradition is based primarily on the Sanskrit canon. And so the Sanskrit teachings disseminated from India, from especially Nalanda Monastery, which you may have heard of, a great monastery in the north of India, that the teachings made their way into China, into Japan, into Korea, as well as some into Vietnam. And then, of course, the main movement of the teachings that we're interested in is into Tibet, and then of course the Himalayan region, which would include Mongolia and the countries in that immediate area, Bhutan, what have you, Nepal. So the two main corpus or bodies of teachings that the Buddha gave, the Pali Canon and the Sanskrit Canon, what we're mostly looking at, again, are things that came out of the Sanskrit tradition. In particular, the sutra we're studying is part of the Prajnaparamita, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, which were one of the greatest gems, if you will, of the Sanskrit tradition. So as I said, in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, we have been able to put this all through the kindness of our great masters of the past into the Lam-Rim tradition. So let me see, there it goes, page down. So this very first point, the levels of the Lam Rim and their goals. So the Lam Rim, the stages of the path, is a way that all of this has been structured to look at not just the Sanskrit teachings, but the Pali Canon that as it was formulated into the very basic Sanskrit teachings, and to summarize them in terms of three main goals that we want to achieve that could be further delineated down into two goals. The first goal, the goal of higher status. So most of you have studied the Lam Rim, and you know that the very first level of the Lam Rim is where we set our aim on having a good rebirth. We have a good rebirth now. We've been able to attain this through the force of our own good karma and all the kindness of our teachers that have helped us to practice the morality that has led us to be able to have this human rebirth that is complete with so many wonderful conditions. We want to, continue to have higher status, continue to have good rebirths. So the very first level of the Lam Rim is directed at that. The second and the third levels of the Lam Rim are directed at the goals that we call definite goodness. This idea of definite or certain goodness is the fact that the goal of higher status, there's no definiteness to that. We can end up with a good human rebirth like we have now, but if we don't use it well, then we can fall to a lower rebirth. So the goodness that we have is only temporary. Whereas if we attain the goal of liberation, which is where we have removed all the causes of our own suffering, as well as the goal of enlightenment, where we have not just done that work, but we have gone on to achieve Buddhahood. Both of those qualify for what we call definite goodness. They are irreversible states. They are states of goodness that we all can achieve, and once we achieve them, we will not fall from them. So the three levels of the Lam Rim are set up in regard to, first, the goal of higher status, gaining a good rebirth, the goal of the definite goodness of liberation, which is what the middle scope is aimed at, and then finally, the great scope is aimed at the goal of definite goodness of Buddhahood. So to achieve either of those states of definite goodness, we need to realize emptiness. This is the second bullet point here on the screen. For both liberation, what we call liberation here, and enlightenment, liberation being equivalent to attaining the state of an arhat, a foe destroyer, someone who has completely removed all the afflictions in their mind, all the delusions, all the causes of their own suffering. Or the goal of enlightenment, where we have gone on to complete Buddhahood, where we have attained not just that liberation from our own suffering, but we have attained a state where we can then help others to do the same through the state of Buddhahood. We have to realize emptiness. Emptiness is not necessary to attain higher status. That's not taught at the very first level of the Lam Rim. It's taught at a much higher level because we want to be sure to apply those teachings when they're appropriate. But in order to attain either of those goals that are involved in definite goodness, liberation or enlightenment, we absolutely must realize emptiness. So therefore, we have the necessity of having or finding the correct view. So this course is very much directed at helping us to find what is the correct view of emptiness on the basis of the words that Avalokiteshvara in the sutra is explaining, as we saw when we read that earlier today. These are the words that signify and that give meaning to the view of emptiness as the Buddha taught it in its final form. So that's pretty much in regard to that. I do have one little quote that I'm sharing here from Nagarjuna, the great master who expounded upon the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. His dates are a little sketchy because in some texts they say that he lived for some 600 years. Nonetheless, it was sometime around the beginning of our common era into the beginning of the first few centuries of like to 200 or so. Anyway, this says, those who do not know emptiness are not a basis for liberation. These obscured ones circle in the prison of the existences of the six migrators. So this is Nagarjuna simply telling us that, again, this is the sole reason, the main reason why we are continuing to go from life to life, caught up in these various migrations, from the hell realms to the animal realms, the preta realms, the hungry ghosts, the human realm, the demigod realm, the god realm. All six of these are caused by our ignorance, by our being obscured and not knowing emptiness. So therefore, the sutra is very, very important in order to give us an opportunity to explore the Buddha's teachings on emptiness, again, in their final form, the way that they were taught most completely, most thoroughly, so that we can achieve this goal. So the next topic is the three turnings of the wheel of Dharma. Let me go off screen here just a little. I don't like to stay on the PowerPoints too long. But for the three turnings of the wheel of Dharma, I need to talk a little bit more about the Buddha and these 45 years or so that he taught. Again, most of you know the story of the Buddha, how he was born as Prince Siddhartha, and he left the palace when he was around 29 years old. He had this experience that he found dissatisfaction in recognizing the nature of existence, seeing that there was suffering that he had been shielded from seeing by his father for so many years. And so once he recognized that there was the suffering of illness, aging, and death, and that this happened to every being, he made the conclusion that he needed to find a way out of this. So he left his home in the palace and studied with these great meditation masters and practiced a variety of ascetic practices to try to attain a liberation from all of that. But he was unable to accomplish that through those means. Nonetheless, the meditation skills that he learned were a very valuable part of his education, his spiritual education. So it's said that some 6 years after he had left the palace, when he was around 35, he made the determination, after regaining his strength from having engaged in those ascetic practices, to sit under the Bodhi tree, and he would be there until he attained some liberation, some freedom, some moksha. And it said that under the Bodhi tree, he attained the state of complete enlightenment. Now, this is the story as it's told in the Hinayana traditions. In the Mahayana traditions, it said that the Buddha was already enlightened when he appeared as Prince Siddhartha, that this was what's called a supreme emanation body. But nonetheless, regardless of what story you adhere to, there was a whole set of teachings that followed from the Buddha's enlightenment. He didn't teach for about the first 49 days after becoming enlightened. Eventually, he decided that it was important, out of his compassion for beings, to share his knowledge. And he shared them initially with the 5 ascetics that he studied with, initially, that he practiced with. And that was the first turning of the wheel of Dharma in Sarnath, Deer Park, and it was the turning of the Four Noble Truths. So before I go back to the screen and talk a little bit about that first turning as well as the other 2 turnings of the Wheel of Dharma, because they're not exactly chronological necessarily, nor do they even point to just one time when the Buddha taught. Because again, the Buddha taught for some 45 years until he passed into nirvana when he was around 80 years old. So for those 45 years, it said that the Buddha used what's called skillful means, or upaya. Upaya essentially means that the Buddha was able, through his omniscience, through his ability to know the minds of other beings, to speak directly to them and tell them exactly what they needed to hear. So in different audiences, different gatherings, the Buddha would teach in different ways. And even it said through the power of his speech, he was able, even in the same gathering, to teach to the different dispositions of the people who were there in the audience. So the Buddha's powers are pretty, amazing in terms of his ability to do this. But consequently, we have a whole lot of teachings that the Buddha gave that cannot all be taken literally. Why? Because some of them are actually contradictory. Some of them actually might say that there is a self, whereas in later teachings he says there is no self, and then there might even be qualifications. Well, there is a self, but there isn't a self in certain ways and what have you. So the whole thing comes down to a need to interpret the teachings to some degree, or at least have some rule for engaging in what's called hermeneutics, which is the study of what's interpretable versus what is definitive in various teachings. So for the Buddha's teachings, this is a very necessary part of our study. And fortunately, we have all these great masters to rely upon who have done this. Lama Tsongkhapa himself, who is the founder of the Gelugpa tradition that we follow, wrote a very wonderful text called what's called the essence of eloquence in particular, where he set out what is it meant to be interpreted and what can we take as definitive in the various systems, and showed how in the end what we have to really rely upon are the teachings on emptiness as being the most definitive, the emptiness that we know of in this particular school that I'll talk about in a minute. So these three turnings of the wheel of Dharma are where the Buddha set out, in essence, three main ways that we can look at things and have some understanding of the truth of what the Buddha taught, but it might not be the final truth. It might not be the way in which we find kind of a final end to all of that. Sorry about the phone ringing here. I just turned the ringer down before I started, but for some reason it's coming on. So I'm just going to let that continue to ring. Let's go back to the slides then, and I can share these and we go through these three turnings of the wheel of Dharma. So the first turning of the wheel of Dharma, and this word Dharma chakra, you may have heard this term, simply means a wheel turning. The first one is the turning of the Four Noble Truths that I mentioned just a few minutes ago. The very first teaching that the Buddha gave, as well as all the subsequent teachings that expounded upon the Four Noble Truths, because again, the Buddha did teach for another 45 years. The second wheel turning is known as the Dharma chakra, teaching the emptiness of intrinsic or inherent existence. This is where the sutra that we're studying, the Heart Sutra, as well as all of what's known as the Prajnaparamita Sutras, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, they all fall into the second wheel turning. This, again, we can say that there was a time when the Buddha taught these on Vulture's Peak, as we saw when we read the sutra together. When this was in the history of the Buddha is very hard to say. There's a lot of debate about when that occurred. But again, any subsequent teachings that expounded upon the emptiness of intrinsic existence would fall into that category of the second wheel turning. The third wheel turning are some teachings that the Buddha gave that delineated kind of what exists and what doesn't exist. This is why it's called the Dharma chakra of fine discrimination. So the fine discrimination means that the Buddha was trying to give teachings for those particular disciples who felt like maybe the second wheel turning had gone too far in saying nothing exists intrinsically or inherently. And then the first wheel turning that seems to be quite holding to conventional existence, that maybe somebody needs teachings that are sort of in the middle of those. Somebody who, isn't really ready to let go of the intrinsic nature of things, but wants some teachings yet to help them to move in that direction. So this will get a little clearer as I go through the next few slides. Again, these teachings were given at a particular time and number of locations, and everything that kind of goes along with them can be said to be part of the third wheel turning. So let's look at each of these a little more individually. Again, this first wheel turning, as I said, is taught at Deer Park near Sarnath. It was primarily intended for disciples of the Hinayana tenets. Now, it's not to say that what the Buddha taught wasn't applicable to all of those following Mahayana tenets. It's just that that was the beginning of what's known as the Pali Canon and the teachings that went into that. And most of what they have in the Pali Canon are the teachings that followed from that. In fact, none of the Mahayana sutras, none of the Sanskrit sutras would be accepted traditionally by most people who follow the Pali Canon because they're not included in that corpus of teachings. And so everything that is taught in these teachings is pretty much taken as definitive for those who are practitioners of the Hinayana tenets. Now again, there's two schools. I'm going to talk about the four tenet systems. It's always hard to say what order I should be putting things in because things get introduced here and there, but I will go into these in a little more detail. The two tenet systems that are philosophical systems that are considered Hinayana are what are known as the Vaibhashika, the Great Exposition, and the Sautrantika, or the Sutra school of tenets. Again, and I apologize that I'm throwing so much at you in this first session, but these are really important concepts to kind of begin to wrestle with, because even when His Holiness the Dalai Lama teaches, if you do have that good fortune to hear him teach, inevitably he talks about some of these different tenet systems and talks about what they adhere to. I was surprised when I was at some introductory teachings that His Holiness gave in France. The first few days were supposed to be an introduction to Buddhism, and he was throwing around Vaibhashika and Sautrantika. So these are very important concepts to kind of get your head around, but we aren't going to go into huge detail on this. Again, at some point in the future, it would be worthwhile, if you are curious, to study the tenets course that will help you to delineate those a bit more. So in this Dharma chakra of the Four Noble Truths, what the Buddha set out were the four truths of, let me take it off screen here so I can do that for a while. The four truths of the truth of suffering or dukkha, that essentially the state of existence that we are in is unsatisfactory and that we have to come to know that, to explore that and be convinced of that. The second of the Four Noble Truths, which is the truth of the causes of our suffering, that there's a reason why we are in this unsatisfactory state. Then there is the third noble truth, which is the truth of the end of our suffering, the cessation of our suffering. That dukkha, this unsatisfactory existence, can come to an end. There can be a cessation. Fourth noble truth is probably where there is the greatest variation in terms of the various systems that came afterwards, all these tenet systems, which is the true path that leads to that, the truth of the actual things that need to be practiced in terms of the wisdom we need to develop and the practices we need to engage in order to accomplish the third noble truth, in order to have a cessation of our suffering. So from the Four Noble Truths, again, although they were taught and adhered to in a fairly strict way by all the Buddhist systems, we all teach them and they're all part of the fundamental tenets of Buddhism. It's not to say that we're identical in terms of how particularly the last two truths are taught. In terms of what does it mean to have a full cessation, and as well as what is the path that leads to that. So we'll get into a bit more delineating that. But in the Hinayana tenet system, these that have come to be identified as that, the Vaibhashika and the Sautrantika schools, what we essentially have are those who took those teachings, the Four Noble Truths and the Pali Canon that was developed on the basis of that, and adhere to that really quite strictly. So although there are some teachings that speak to a form of what we could call emptiness, usually the term that's used is selflessness, there's a form of a negation of a type of self that we think exists. Most of their teachings focus on the lack of that in a person. And we're going to go into those as the last topic that we look at in this introduction, which are the types of selflessness. We can say that there is a selflessness of persons, meaning that each of us needs to come to understand a false way that we think we exist. But in the Mahayana tenets, they tended to also have another level of that where they say, and it's not just persons that don't exist in this fictitious way, it's also phenomena. So they speak to greater results that can be achieved. They also speak to a different path that you need to practice to accomplish those greater goals. So in the Hinayana system, while their main focus was on the Four Noble Truths, they practiced with mostly the intention of achieving liberation. It's not to say that one can't achieve Buddhahood through the lower tenet systems of Vaibhashika and Sautrantika, but they are mostly focused on how do each of us get free of this cycle of existence? How do we break free of the first noble truth, the truth of dukkha, and then how do we get rid of all the causes of that will make sure that it doesn't occur again. So going back to the slides briefly, and we'll do a break here in a moment just to see if there's any questions. The second wheel turning, as I mentioned, this is this Dharma chakra that began with the teachings on Vulture's Peak in Rajagriha. It's kind of interesting. They say Rajagriha is this city, and we'll go into a bit more of the derivation later on of where it got that name. But Vulture's Peak is this peak that is kind of up above it, and maybe even some of you have done the pilgrimage there. I haven't had that good fortune yet, but they say it's actually a very, very small peak. It's not like some huge place, but it is kind of up above Rajagriha. And this is said to be where most of the wheel turning of the Prajnaparamita, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, where all of this occurred. And it was primarily intended for disciples of one of the Mahayana tenets systems, which is what we call the Madhyamika or Madhyamika. Don't know my Sanskrit pronunciation so well, so I'll put both of them out there. This is translated usually as middle way, and that's what I'll probably be referring to it mostly going forward, is the middle way. So the middle way system is, again, one of the two Mahayana tenet systems that embraces the idea, as I said just a few minutes ago, that it's not just people that don't exist in a particular way that we are adhering to, but it's also phenomena. It's also things outside of ourselves. It's the world at large, everything that exists, in fact, that lacks intrinsic existence. And this is the real subject matter of this sutra, is spelling out all the various things. We saw that when we read it together, right? No eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue. All the various things that exist lack intrinsic existence. So we're going to go into more explanation of what that means. But these were very profound teachings. And of course, these can be misunderstood. When we start hearing this, when you read the Heart Sutra and you hear there's no this and no that, you start thinking, nothing exists at all. Well, what's going on then? Do I exist? Does the world exist? Do other sentient beings exist? Does Buddhahood exist? And so there's a very fine way that this is set out, where the Buddha makes sure to clarify that it's not that there's a complete nihilistic view. It's not that nothing exists. It's just that the way things exist, these things like form, feeling, discrimination, and so on, all the various things that are in the sutra, that they don't exist intrinsically or inherently. They do exist conventionally, in dependence upon various factors. So again, this is something we'll go into more as we go through the sutra. But these were very profound teachings because they actually got to a much deeper level of selflessness or emptiness than what was taught previously, particularly at the teaching of the Four Noble Truths, that first wheel turning. So these teachings, in terms of the middle way system, the middle way system looks at these teachings, particularly the highest branch of the middle way that I'll explain in a moment when we get to the tenet systems. They look at the teachings of the Prajnaparamita and say that these are absolutely definitive. This is the way in which the Buddha taught the final view of emptiness. So they don't need to necessarily go on to have any kind of additional clarification. Those who are inclined towards the middle way find everything they need, in a sense, or the majority of what they need, right here in the second wheel turning in the Prajnaparamita Sutras. But as I said, there were some that needed this third wheel turning. There were some that needed a finer discrimination, that needed the Buddha to say, well, there are some things that don't exist, but there are some things that exist, and so I'm going to clarify that and give some teaching so that people don't fall into a more nihilistic view. So these sutras were taught at Vaishali, and there were a number of other places. So again, it's not just a particular time or a particular place. There are a variety of ways that these were taught. One of the most renowned sutras that is in this corpus of the third wheel turning is called the Sutra Unraveling the Thought, which has a lot of meaning to it. It's like the intention to unravel the thought of what the Buddha meant, the intention of what the Buddha meant in giving particular teachings. So the disciples that this was primarily intended for are the Chitta Matra. Chitta is mind, and Matra is only. So this is mind only. That is the other of the two Mahayana tenet systems. So Chitta Matra is this kind of interesting system that is, again, part of the Mahayana. So it is looking at a selflessness of phenomena, but it's taking a very different look at it based on an interpretation of these sutras that the Buddha gave as part of the third wheel turning, where they delineate kind of three different ways of looking at phenomena in terms of what does exist, what doesn't exist, and so on. And I'm not going to go into that in great detail because, once more, it's really outside of the scope of what we're looking at. This is just to give some grounding in terms of where this sutra resides in regard to these three wheel turnings. So yeah, before I go on to the four schools of Buddhist tenets, let me just do a short break here where I can take a drink of water, and I can also open it up to see if there are any questions. And if, again, you do have a question, you can unmute your mic and ask.
Hi, Don. I do have a
Hi,
question.
Jennifer. Great.
Um, if someone wished for personal liberation, could they actually achieve that by sticking with the Hinayana tenet systems, or would they need to eventually understand Madhyamaka?
Right. That's a good question, Jennifer. And according to Madhyamaka, according to the tenets of the middle way, it's essential that someone understand the same emptiness that is taught in the middle way. So for a Hinayana practitioner, we're going to look at those in a moment, what we call a hearer or a solitary realizer, these two types of practitioners. In order for them to achieve liberation, or the state of arhat, foe destroyer, it's said, according to middle way, that they have to realize that emptiness of intrinsic existence, inherent existence. To realize only one of the coarser forms of selflessness or emptiness is not going to do the trick. And they would say that, again, in terms of the Chitta Matra system, they would look at the Chitta Matra system and say, what you say you want to realize to achieve Buddhahood isn't going to get you to Buddhahood. You have to realize what is set out in the Prajnaparamita in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. So according to, again, and I guess this all comes down to our own experience, if we do decide that we want to pursue all of this knowledge to a much greater degree, we can find for ourselves what really does the trick. I'll be setting out in front of you the different forms of selflessness, not all of them, but the major ones that are taught as part of the different tenet systems. And it's said that some of these are really quite coarse. Even what some of the lower schools say is a subtler version of the selflessness of persons, for example, an emptiness of how the person exists. The highest school of the middle way says that this isn't going to get you anywhere. I mean, it is useful to have that realization, but it's not going to help you achieve liberation in the end. It won't actually remove what is keeping you bound in samsara, in your own suffering. And then again, it won't even get you to Buddhahood for those who are practicing the Mahayana tenets and want to achieve Buddhahood. So do know that both of these systems, the Hinayana and the Mahayana tenet systems, they all four schools, Vaibhashika, Sautrantika, Chittamatra, and Madhyamaka, all of them teach all three vehicles. The vehicle of the hearer, the solitary realizer that I just mentioned, these two are intent on liberation, their own liberation, but they also teach a bodhisattva path. Now, they don't teach it to the degree that it's taught in the Mahayana tenets, but nonetheless, they do say that there are those practitioners who do want to become a Buddha, who practice the bodhisattva path. Shakyamuni Buddha was one, for example. So in the Pali tradition, the Theravadan tradition, they will say, yes, there was Buddha Shakyamuni who practiced this amazing path. It was very arduous and took him many, many lifetimes to achieve Buddhahood. He taught for 45 years, and that's the end of Buddha Shakyamuni. He passes into nirvana and no more teachings from the Buddha. In the Mahayana traditions, they say that's not quite how it works, that the Buddha becomes an eternal force in the world to help sentient beings and continues to benefit others even after a lifetime like that when the Buddha taught. So again, to achieve any of these goals, whether it be self-liberation, the arhat attainment, or whether it be complete enlightenment, which is what the bodhisattva aims to attain in terms of Buddhahood, according to the middle way system, you absolutely must realize the emptiness of intrinsic existence. Again, this is all the more importance of why we have to study this well, why we have to engage in our own reflection and investigation of this topic of emptiness. Okay, thanks for that question, Jennifer.
Thank
You're welcome. Any other follow-up or from that or anything else? So let's go on then to talk about these tenet systems. There was something else I was going to share, but maybe I'll share that later, because it is important just to, again, look at these four. We just had the names of them, and I'm not going to go into great detail about them. But in the Hinayana tenets, we have the Vaibhashika, the Great Exposition system. It's kind of interesting, even though the Vaibhashika system is said to be fairly basic and not that involved because of the what it relies upon. A lot of the Vaibhashika tenets are adopted by the highest school, the middle way consequent school, Madhyamika Prasangika. So just know that there are some things within Vaibhashika that are adhered to by some of the higher schools. The Sautrantika Sutra school, you may have heard of folks like Dharmakirti and Dignaga. These were main proponents of this Sautrantika school and helped to expound upon, in reliance upon sutra, a way to attain liberation. Now, the current tradition that we have in this world that we call the Theravadan tradition does seem to be some sort of an offshoot of Vaibhashika, but I really think we have to be careful in our delineation of people as Hinayana or Mahayana, even in regard to their tenets, because it's hard to say what exactly people study and practice. We're living in a world where there's much more intermingling of different Buddhist teachings, whereas in the initial days of the Buddha, the Pali Canon would make its way into a country, and that would be all that they had in terms of their Buddhist studies. Nowadays, you see even monks from the Thai tradition or what have you sitting in the audience when His Holiness is teaching. So they're receiving teachings from a variety of people in a variety of ways in both the Sanskrit and the Pali tradition. So I don't know that we can delineate the Theravadan tradition in a real narrow way and say that they're following this kind of individual vehicle of the Hinayana, which is how Robert Thurman defines this, and I really like his description. The technical, or if you're literal way of defining Hinayana is the lesser vehicle, but essentially it means those who really can only take on the burden of their individual liberation. Those who feel like the most they can handle is getting themselves out of samsara, which is wonderful. That's what the Buddha's teachings are there for, is to help all beings to be free of their suffering. So the main thing that the Vaibhashika and the Sautrantika teach are the techniques for attaining that. But they don't say that you can't attain Buddhahood. They just say that that's a much more lofty goal for those who have greater courage and stamina. And most of what they're going to focus on are, again, based on that first wheel turning, the Four Noble Truths, and so on. And they're going to expound upon that. And give people the tools to attain self-liberation. Now, to Jennifer's question, in the Vaibhashika and the Sautrantika, if you go to the Pali Canon, there actually are some of the sutras in the Pali Canon that do speak to this subtler view of emptiness that we're studying in the Heart Sutra. So it's not that they don't exist there, it's just that, again, historically, they maybe weren't as emphasized because it does, kind of move us closer to a more nihilistic view. Not that we ever fall into it, hopefully, but nonetheless, when we start saying that none of these things exist intrinsically, that has to be clarified so that we make sure that we don't think that things don't exist at all. So the Vaibhashika and Sautrantika tend to rely upon the Pali Canon, but know that within the Pali Canon, there still are some teachings that do allude to this subtler view of emptiness that we're studying in this course. The Mahayana tenets, the Chittamatra and the Madhyamaka, mind only and middle way, again, the main difference is that they do expound this idea of emptiness of all phenomena, not just persons. And the first two, because they felt like there was a desire simply to attain mostly self-liberation, they felt like the main obstacle is the strong adherence to some view of ourselves, the I, the person. Whereas in the Chittamatra and the Madhyamaka, the goal there for many of the practitioners is the goal of a bodhisattva, the goal to attain enlightenment. And so in that way, they feel that those who want to attain liberation have one path that they might follow, but those who want to attain enlightenment have another path. And so they're trying to support the deeper knowledge that is necessary to attain the goal of enlightenment through teaching the selflessness of phenomena, that there are ways that things around us, everything that exists in the world, doesn't exist. So again, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the views of selflessness of these two and how they're differentiated. But know that within the middle way, there was a bit of a break that occurred after Nagarjuna, who the verse I read earlier, and again, he was sometime towards the beginning of our Common Era, he was expounded upon by a great practitioner named Buddha Palita. And Buddha Palita really just set out in more delineation exactly what Nagarjuna said, but made it very clear that Nagarjuna was expounding upon this idea of the emptiness of intrinsic existence. Well, there was another Indian master called Bhavaviveka who took offense at what Buddha Palita said and said, no, you're misinterpreting Nagarjuna. And he became kind of the founder of this moving in the direction of what's called here the autonomy school, Svatantrika. Svatantrika is a branch of the middle way that, as we'll see in terms of its selflessness, it doesn't go quite as far as the final view of the Buddha, which is the last one on our list here. So Bhavaviveka took issue with Buddha Palita and began this track that became the Svatantrika school. Chandrakirti, who many of you have heard of, ended up refuting Bhavaviveka and said, no, Bhavaviveka, Buddha Palita had it right, and he was interpreting Nagarjuna perfectly fine. And so nonetheless, Chandrakirti is part of this whole lineage that has come to expound upon what's known as the Prasangika or Prasangika. Again, I don't know. I've never studied Sanskrit, so I can't tell you for sure how these are pronounced. You'll hear different people pronounce them differently. But this literally means the consequence school. So what we are studying in this sutra is the middle way consequence school view of emptiness. It is said to be the highest, the most profound. It's the view that I just mentioned in my answer to Jennifer, that we all have to realize whether we want the definite goodness of liberation or the definite goodness of complete enlightenment. It is the view of emptiness that is the true middle way. By middle way, we mean that it is able to skirt between two extremes. Let me take it off here for a second. So in terms of these two extremes, I've already mentioned one of them, which is nihilism, sort of a view of annihilation, that somehow things don't exist at all. Well, we know that that would be problematic, right? Because then we fall into this view that nothing matters. It doesn't matter what we do with our actions. It doesn't matter what we do with this life because nothing exists at all. Obviously, this isn't what the Buddha was teaching. But it is said that when we begin to learn these teachings, that sometimes we fall into the view of nihilism, that we hear these words and we think that things don't exist at all. And that may be something that can be an indicator that we are going too far in regard to how we're interpreting these teachings. The other extreme that we tend to be in is this extreme that we're in currently, which is the view of existence or permanence, that we are adhering to some view of the self of persons, this I that we have so strongly in ourselves, or of phenomena around us that we think exists in this concrete, intrinsic way. This is the extreme that all of us are in currently that we need to be moved away from towards the middle way. And they say finding the middle way is a real tricky job. That's why we need to engage in study like this. We need to engage in what are called the three wisdoms. The wisdom of hearing, listening, which is not just listening to me go blah, blah, blah about what I've learned and how I've the words I'm giving to you about this sutra, but also our own study through reading, through listening to other teachers, listening to Lama Zopa teach on emptiness in the Heart Sutra. All of these things can be really useful to bring that information in initially. There's already some wisdom there. That's the first level of wisdom. The second level of wisdom is the wisdom that arises when we reflect upon these teachings and we contemplate them. And for most of us, that's what our meditation is, what we call our analytical meditation. And what I would encourage you to do as part of this course, again, is to reflect upon these words of the sutra and so on, to deepen your own understanding, to reflect upon the techniques for realizing emptiness. I'll introduce some of those as we go through this course. Um, then there is the wisdom that arises from meditation, which is where meditation becomes more powerful, where we are actually able to make that meditation change the fabric of our minds, if you will, to kind of deepen our own understanding of things. So obviously we have to get to that point if we're going to achieve real progress, but we can't do that without the other two. We have to engage in the wisdom from listening and hearing. We have to engage in the wisdom that arises from our reflection, contemplation, thinking about these teachings, and then eventually that takes root in a more profound form of meditation where we can actually change our thinking at a much deeper level. So all of these teachings on emptiness are really important in order for us to be able to do that. So again, this is just going back to the screen with the four tenet systems. We should primarily rely upon then this second wheel turning, which is what the middle way school was involved in, the Prajnaparamita Sutras, and in particular the Prasangika interpretation of this, in particular this final view of emptiness that helps us to understand exactly what doesn't exist and what does exist. So I want to do one more point on the tenets just to make sure that we're clear then, because I did mention this in alluding to it, but you can be Hinayana or Mahayana by tenets, which is what we just said. There's those four systems that you can follow kind of their own sort of track. As I said, it's hard to say where Theravadan fits in, and I don't know that there are full-fledged Sautrantika practitioners around. I think to some degree the Chitta Matra has been brought into the Zen tradition to some degree, but I don't know enough about the Zen tradition to say for sure. The Zen practitioners I've talked to said that yes, there is some flavor of that, but so we can say that there is Hinayana or Mahayana by tenets, whether you're following any of these four. But then there's also Hinayana or Mahayana by path. And that's essentially what we are calling, again, the three vehicles. So there are those on the Hinayana path, which are hearers and solitary realizers. Again, I've got the Sanskrit up there, Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas. These two types of practitioners are intent upon achieving their own liberation, the definite goodness of self-liberation. Hearers, they say, hear the Mahayana teachings, but they don't follow them, but they definitely congregate with others and hear teachings. Solitary realizers are those who have some greater confidence in their own abilities and decide that in their last lifetime before attaining their liberation, they want to be born in a place where they're solitary, where there's no teachers around. So they can even teach others to some degree. They don't have the compassion and the motivation of a bodhisattva, but in their last life in samsara, they do want to be kind of in that state. Then finally, the Mahayana path, third vehicle, is what we are studying and practicing, the Bodhisattva path. So it's just to delineate that, because as I said, in each of those four tenet systems, so if one were a Vaibhashika, one still could follow the Bodhisattva path. But again, whether one can achieve Bodhisattva, a Buddha state, through the tenets of Hinayana is debatable. But nonetheless, these are the ways in which I just want to make sure that there's some clarity in terms of how Hinayana and Mahayana are used. Mahayana, again, being that universal vehicle that does embrace the greater good of all beings, but when it's referring to a tenet system, it's referring to the particular systems of Chittamatra and Madhyamika that do teach a bit more profound truth in regard to the wisdom of emptiness. So again, this was just something I thought I should throw in there. Maybe it's throwing too much at you on this first session, but you can always go back to these again, and I'm happy to supply a full set of all of these that I've been putting on screen to Maria that she can forward on to you in like a PDF file. Next thing that I want to talk about, which really gets at what, if we say that these are four different philosophical systems that the Buddha set out, well, where is their biggest difference? Their biggest difference is in only one of what are called the four seals of Buddhism. The four seals of Buddhism are these four, and you may have heard of these before. There's lots of teachings out there. I think there's even a book, I can't remember who it's by right now. It's called What Makes You Not a Buddhist, where he goes through each of these four and says, if you're not believing this, then guess what? You're not a Buddhist. So the first one, all composite phenomena are impermanent. The language I'm using here is, by the way, from His Holiness's book called The World of Tibetan Buddhism. What do we mean by composite? Composite phenomena are those things that are produced, those things that arise from causes and conditions. So this is everything from, an apple that grows on a tree to an Apple computer, to a person, to a mind, to whatever it is that is produced from causes and conditions, that has causes and conditions behind it that give rise to it coming into existence. The very first tenet or seal of what makes something Buddhist and our own philosophy is that we think that all of those composite phenomena, we hold that they are impermanent. By impermanent, we don't mean that they necessarily go out of existence, but they are changing constantly. Most of them do go out of existence. For example, that apple on the tree, it eventually rots or is eaten or what have you, but nonetheless, it is changing momentarily, always in the process of change. And of course, this is part of why we suffer, is because we want things to be permanent, but they're impermanent. We want things to stay the same, but they're constantly in flux. And there's always that uncertainty that goes along with that. So this is one thing that speaks to a part of why we are suffering, but it is something that is held by all four Buddhist tenet systems. Second one, all contaminated things and events are unsatisfactory. This is the truth of dukkha, the truth of suffering, the first of the Four Noble Truths, right? That everything that is contaminated with our ignorance, meaning everything that arises due to the causes of suffering, the second Noble Truth, all of those things and events are unsatisfactory. They don't bring us any real peace or happiness. They only bring us more of the same, more dissatisfaction. So again, the first two of these, we would say absolutely, in terms of how these are defined and how these are talked about, all tenet systems of Buddhism agree to that. And we would say to some degree, they all agree with number three, that all phenomena are empty and selfless. The interpretation of that is going to be very different though, because in the lower systems, they'll say, well, an apple isn't, empty of being a self, but nonetheless, it does exist as kind of not the object of a person who exists in a particular way. I'll explain that more when we get into the views of selflessness. So they say that things can be selfless in terms of the person that uses them or that relates to them, is selfless. And so they're selfless because they're an object of use by that person. But of course, the most profound way that that third seal is taught is in the middle way system that we're studying here, the Prasangika, the consequence school. So essentially, this is speaking to something that, again, is very unique to Buddhism, that all phenomena have some way that we could talk about them being selfless or empty, whether it be as an object of use by a person who is selfless, or whether they be empty or selfless in and of themselves, which is what the higher systems teach. And again, this is something I'll be expounding upon. I don't think that my little explanation here is the end of that. Fourth one is that nirvana, the peace that one attains when one accomplishes the removal of the sources of suffering, when one achieves the third noble truth, that is true peace. By true peace, we mean that it is something that is eternal, that it is lasting, that it will not change, it will not deteriorate. So we can say that definitely the first, second, and fourth are pretty much defined the same. Now, again, there are different types of nirvana that we could go into that the higher systems think can be established. The non-abiding nirvana that a Buddha has, where they can continue to be active in the world, whereas the earlier systems, the Sautrantika and Vaibhashika, would say that when a Buddha finishes their time in this earth, they disappear into nirvana and they never are seen again. I mean, so there's different ways that we might interpret what a nirvana means, but nirvana is peace. It is the goal that we are all trying to achieve. What that looks like for individual practitioners might be very different. So there are, again, all four of these that are shared by all the Buddhist systems, but how we would define the third one in terms of what we really mean by emptiness or selflessness is going to vary. So that's why I felt like the last subject to talk about today, and this may be all that I have time for, is the types of selflessness that are taught in the various systems. And this is meant to be, again, just a brief introduction, because if you were to study the tenet systems, you would get much more detail in terms of how they apply to each individual school. But what we mean by this term selflessness, and sometimes we interchange this with emptiness, and it gets very confusing in Buddhism because we sometimes talk about a self that exists, a self that doesn't exist. Whenever we use the word selflessness, we mean a form of self or identity that doesn't exist. And whether we talk about that being the identity of a person or the identity of an apple or whatever phenomenon that we're talking about, we are talking about that lacking that identity, lacking some way that it can be established that we think exists, but it doesn't actually exist. That's why sometimes the word emptiness is used, is because we say things are empty or lacking a particular way of existing. So often we talk about delineating then these two types of selflessness. Again, this is not news because I've been talking about this earlier in regard to these introductory topics, is the idea that we can say there's a selflessness of persons. So we can talk about that in regard to either the I that is ourselves, or even other people like all of you who are joining me here today. Those are all persons. They are people, beings. And this, of course, doesn't just refer to human beings. This refers to every being, animals, hungry ghosts, gods, what have you, whatever realm beings are in. They are the object of that view of selflessness, where we look at the person and we come to an understanding that the person doesn't exist in a particular way. It lacks a particular self or identity. Then there is a form of selflessness that, again, the Mahayana tenets stress, which is the selflessness of phenomena, where it isn't just that these things are not objects of use of people, but rather that they are in and of themselves lacking a particular identity. They are empty of existing in a particular way. Again, the most profound one being the middle way system. So when we say phenomena, we mean things that are other than persons. We mean things that are not people. So this would be chairs and apples and computers and whatever else existed. So those are the two types of selflessness that we can delineate. The selflessness of persons, I'm going to just introduce these. Again, this starts to get really complex, and it's not as important to our study of this sutra, but it's just to give you a flavor for the ways in which the Buddha taught at different times different ways that we can say there is a selflessness of persons. That when we look at this I, this person that we are, we can say that there is a non-existence or a lack of a particular type of person, that some of these, or at least one of these, is something we may only have on an artificial basis, meaning that we've only acquired it because people have taught us that. But most of these we have innately. We have them within our minds. We tend to look at ourselves and think of ourselves in a particular way that the Buddha says is fiction. It's not in line with reality. Therefore, these are selfless. They don't exist in this way. So let's talk about the first one, because it is the one that is acquired. This is the view that came out of the tradition that was already there in India when the Buddha taught, the tradition of the Vedic systems, where they said that essentially there was this thing called an Atman. Atman. Atman is like usually interpreted as soul. And many of us grew up in spiritual traditions in the West where we were taught that there was a soul, and that soul was kind of the essence of who you were. And in the Hindu or Vedic traditions, there is this idea of the Atman, which is a permanent, single, independent person. By permanent, we mean that kind of unchanging essence of who we are, that it is unitary or single, meaning it's only one thing, it doesn't have any parts, it's kind of standing on its own, and that it is independent of any causes and conditions. This idea of this type of person is not something we have innately. But if we've been taught this, if you've grown up in a tradition where you've learned that there's this idea of a soul, this may be an initial thing we need to examine. Is there something there that is not the mind or the body, this collection of stuff that we generally refer to as me, myself, but is there something else there that is this sort of soul or Atman? This is the most basic thing that we can say all Buddhist tenets, when it comes to that third seal, they would say absolutely. Every one of them would say there is no doubt that the person, it does not exist in this way. That the persons are empty of being permanent, single, independent in that way, being a sort of Atman or a soul. And then, of course, they would say that phenomena, therefore, are empty of being that way because they're not objects of use of such a person. Again, it's a real strange way of interpreting selflessness of phenomena, but that third seal would be interpreted in that way, saying that all phenomena are empty and selfless means that there's no permanent, single, independent person who exists or who uses objects that exist. So this is the coarsest, absolute coarsest way that we can talk about selflessness of persons. And there is one system, I think, within the Vaibhashika, a few small sub-schools of Vaibhashika that say this is enough to get you liberated, is to realize the lack of that. Most of the other tenet systems say, no, that's not true. You have to realize the second one on our list. That second bullet point is the idea that there's no self-sufficient, substantially existent person. Again, a lot of words. What do these words mean? They mean that there is something that can be identified as existing that is the person, that is, can be recognized without the aggregates being there, meaning without the body and mind being there. So if we were to take away the body and mind, is there a person that exists that is kind of the controller, the master over the body and the mind? Sometimes we think that way, right? We think, I think it's one of the teachings of His Holiness that I listened to recently, where he said that if you were given the opportunity to exchange this body for a younger body, you would think, oh, I'd happily do that. I'd rather have a younger body than the body I have currently. Well, that gets this idea that there's some sort of you that exists independent of that body. But we might even do that with our mind too, right? We might say, well, I've got a pretty good mind, but I'd rather have a much sharper, clearer mind, a mind that knows more and that has a greater ability to meditate. We might think, oh, I would happily exchange my mind as well for a much better mind. Well, who is that person that is involved in exchanging those things? This is this idea that there's something that exists in its own self-sufficient way. It doesn't depend upon the mind and the body to be known, that has that form of being existing there on its own, but it's part of the group. It's not completely independent in that regard. Sometimes Jeffrey Hopkins uses this idea of like a head salesman. So you might have a sales department. It has many salespeople in it, but you have a head salesperson. The head salesperson is a salesperson, but they kind of oversee the other salespeople. They make sure they're doing what they're doing and so on. This is the view of a self-sufficient, substantially existent person. According to the highest school, to the middle way tenets, this is innate within us. All of us have this. This isn't the main target that we need to have in terms of realizing emptiness, but it's a good stepping stone because it begins to move in the territory of trying to examine what person really is there. And if we are holding this to some degree, as I said, through our language and our thinking, it can become problematic for us because it doesn't exist. There is no head salesperson here. There is no lord or master that oversees the mind and body. This is a fiction that we have created and that has been with us since beginningless time. Now, again, most of the other tenet systems will say if you get rid of this, if you realize the non existence of this self sufficient, substantially existent person, you will actually attain liberation. But again, as I answered to Jennifer's question, according to the middle way system, it's not enough. You have to realize the last bullet point that's on this sheet. We could say to some degree that the third one is also a way that we could talk about the person. This about Tantrika Madhyamaka, again, that other subset of the middle way school, does say that there is no truly existent person. They don't say that that's necessary to realize in order to attain liberation, but nonetheless, they would say the person doesn't truly exist. Now, what do they mean by truly exist? They have a slightly modified way of talking about that because in the consequence middle way school, we might even use that term, not truly existent, but it would mean something different there. What they would say is that there is no person that exists kind of completely independent, but there's something that is the person nonetheless that can be established that once you have an awareness knowing it, then you have the person there. We're not going to go quite as far as what the middle way consequence school says in saying it depends entirely upon an imputation or designation of person. But nonetheless, there's going to be kind of that imputation, that knowing what a person is through designating a person, as well as something from the side of the mind and body that determine that that's a person. Kind of this is the last little holdout that practitioners often have because they think that there's still got to be something within the object that indicates what it is, in this case, the person. When we finally get to the last point of view, when we say there's no inherently existent person or intrinsically existent person, we mean there is nothing from the side of this mind and body, from the side of what we often identify as the person, that is the person. Person is only imputed, merely designated to this collection of stuff. This is the view that we're going to be exploring as we look at the Heart Sutra, is to see that in emptiness, none of these things exist because they don't have any existence from their own side. The person can't exist intrinsically, inherently, or we would find it when we look for it. But nonetheless, it does still exist, but in a very, very subtle way. It only exists because we designate this collection of stuff as I or as a person. So again, this might sound like a lot of words right now, but we'll be going through this as we study the Heart Sutra and coming to fine tune our understanding of what this fourth bullet point really means in regard to the person, as well as in regard to phenomena. So the last thing that I'm going to try to go through a little quickly here, because the last two on this are exactly the same. The non-existence of truly existent phenomena means that things, again, they've got something from their own side, but it depends upon a consciousness knowing them. That's what we mean by that, just like we said with persons. And the third bullet point is exactly what we just said about persons in the middle way consequence school, which is that there's nothing from the side of the basis, nothing from the side of any phenomenon in terms of its basis that is what that determines what it is. Instead, it is just the designating consciousness that designates apples and computers and everything else in our world. The first one on there is a unique one that is, again, part of that third wheel turning that the Chittamatra interpreted this view that the Buddha was giving, that I want to do this in a very brief way, but they essentially say that what we identify as external objects, what we identify as things outside of ourselves, and the subjective awareness that is knowing them, we think these are kind of different entities. But in their view, these are both arising from a karmic seed on our mental continuum. And in that way, there are no real external objects. They are just kind of like a movie that is projected into our mind on the basis of this karmic seed ripening. A very strange view, and I'm not going to teach it as part of this course because it's not really the subject of the Heart Sutra. But it's a very different view of emptiness because it's essentially saying that the world around us is like it's an illusion. It's all this stuff happening, but it doesn't really exist as an external world. The middle way schools say, no, it is an external world. It just doesn't exist inherently or intrinsically, according to the consequence school. So, wow, that was a lot of words. So let's stop the share here. And I know you'll probably have more questions that may not even be evident to you at this point in terms of what I just went through. But the main point was, again, to delineate that there are two different views of selflessness. In the final view of middle way consequence school, it's just depending upon what basis we use, because it's the lack of intrinsic existence, the non-existence of inherent existence on either the basis of a person or the basis of some phenomenon other than persons. And this is what we're going to be studying. And again, you can see that from the different perspectives that I shared, that there's a lot of different ways that the Buddha taught on how to approach this topic of selflessness or emptiness. If this were a survey of all of those, this course were about all of that in terms of tenets and what have you, we'd go into those in more detail. But I'm just trying to give you an overview that there are, again, the skillful means that the Buddha used in order to help each of us find some sort of path that we can follow, something we can adhere to and say, oh, this is a good teaching for me because it helps me to overcome some misunderstandings I have. But we want to get to the final misunderstanding as much as possible. We want to arrive at that wisdom realizing emptiness of intrinsic existence, which is the second wheel turning, which is the subject of the Heart Sutra. So, any questions? It's 11:30 already. Wow. No? Are you all stymied?
I will leave the questions when we will for the next round.
Okay. And if you do want to write questions, again, you can write them to me. I'm putting all this stuff on Maria. You can write them to me as well. I'm sure Maria can give you my email address, and then you'll have that. But just know that, yeah, it might be helpful to get some of the questions ahead of time, and then I'll be sure to have answers for all of them when we start. Okay, good. Thanks, Francesca. Francesco, thank you. Anyone else? Okay, so what I would like you to do is, again, we haven't really gotten into the heart of the text yet. We're going to go into that and the commentary in the next session. But I would encourage you to read this sutra daily. I'll tell a real brief little story. You know, when I was in the master's program in Italy, it was funny, the Snow Lion came out with a little book about how to do a divination, what's called a mo in Tibetan, and there was a little dice, a die that came with it. And I took it over to Italy with me, the master's program, and I thought I'd try a divination one day. And I did this divination, and the reading I got was like the most horrific reading you could get. And so I did it again, and I got the exact same reading. So I went to Geshe Jampa Gyatso, my teacher in Italy, and I was terrified. I was like, Geshe-la, I've done this divination, and it's saying that I've got all this horrible stuff that's going to happen, and da-da-da-da. Do you have some advice for me, or can you help me clarify all this? And he looked at me and he just said, oh, just recite the Heart Sutra every day and you'll be fine. So the Heart Sutra is very powerful in terms of removing obstacles and in terms of just helping us to, I don't know, keep in touch with this really profound truth that is something we want to, you know, realize at a very deep level at some point. So what I would encourage you to do is daily, if possible, recite the Heart Sutra. It's good to read the words out loud. You know, we're used to reading in our culture, you know, just reading it silently. But it's really good to read them out loud, and even to read them out loud to animals or other people that are around you, what have you, so that they hear the words, if you can do that comfortably. But it's good to read it. And then if you do want to, you know, pause at any point and reflect on it, that's perfectly fine. Or even at the end, just to pause and reflect, do a little meditation on your own understanding of emptiness. Again, every one of you is in this class, I'm sure, because you've got some desire to strengthen your view of emptiness, your understanding of emptiness. So hopefully you already have something to work with in terms of that. So that would be my suggestion for the next week or so. And if you want to begin to look at the commentary, you're welcome to do that. Know that the introduction to the commentary is a little strange. It goes into a number of topics that are really quite peripheral, and I'm going to touch on a few of those. But about the first, I don't know, up through about page 9 in the middle. There's not going to be quite so much that I'm going to comment on because it just goes into the history of Ananda writing the sutras and all these other things. It's just things that I don't know that I need to talk about quite so much, because I think it's more important that we spend time with the actual words of the sutra. So again, please take a look at what's sent to you. We'll send the slides to you. Take a look at the commentary if you wish. There are a few books that I will send you in a reference reading list that I would recommend, particularly His Holiness's book called The Essence of the Heart Sutra. That is really quite nice. But anyway, let's have a little dedication then to conclude today. Let's think that through the power of what we've done this last hour and a half, may we achieve the state of Buddhahood in order to lead all beings to that state. And may this precious mind of bodhicitta that has not yet risen in our minds come to rise, and may that which has already arisen grow and deepen very strongly so that we might achieve that goal of Buddhahood quickly. And lastly, let's dedicate for the good health and long lives of all of our precious teachers, particularly His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Kyabje Zopa Rinpoche, our spiritual director, as well as all the other teachers and guides that we and others have in our lives that are helping us to find true peace and happiness. May they all have good health and long lives. Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate you joining today.